What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over how you can make an advanced minimap in your game. So I know of one method to do this, just like we knew of one method for the basic minimap, which is to have another camera. The other method I'm aware of is a stylized minimap. So a lot of games will use your stylized minimap. As I mentioned last time, your basic minimaps will be used by some indie games and some games where performance isn't really an issue, or some simulations where performance isn't an issue. But a lot of times your minimaps will be stylized to some extent, meaning that they will be either drawn, they will have like they'll be made to look like an actual map, or like like an artist made a rendition of the area. Basically, it's going to be a map that isn't just a camera looking down and displaying things, but rather it's going to be this actual stylized map that you would use just like in real life. For that effect, you can see as we're moving around, it is tracking basically where we are in relation to the map. So the center point of that minimap in the top right is basically where the player currently is. So as I walk into corners, you can see the corner is essentially in the center of the minimap. So we haven't added the special symbols for each character walking around, but we will cover that next time. Today, we're going to go over this advanced minimap system where you can have a stylized minimap. You can draw on it and make it look however you would like. So the way we're going to do this is going to be relatively complex, but it's actually a very well-documented method, and it's pretty much, as far as I can understand it, this is the way to go about it. It's actually the way we are using it in our secret project that I'm working on that has not been announced yet. And so I'm going to give you a little tip on how to make this work in this way. So before I do, if you'd like to get caught up in the series, this is episode, I believe, 31 of the third-person tutorial series, really of the action RPG tutorial series, but we have a ton of extra episodes for the third-person tutorial series that we made before this, so I'll leave the entire playlist to every third-person episode right here. You can click on that and get caught up with everything we've done to date. And then I will also leave this video right here, which is the basic minimap system. If you're not really worried about performance, but you just want to have another camera that can render and display data to the HUD. All right, and otherwise, let's get started. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to need an image of the map, or we're going to need to actually manually draw this map and relate it to the size of the world that we're in. You can do either. However, the easiest method, especially for someone without artistic ability, such as myself, is to basically grab an image of the map. What we have to do is link up something to this scene capture component 2D. That way we can actually visualize what it is that we have. So I go to where I want to create my render target. I add or import, and I go to materials and textures, and then render target. When you make a new one, it won't really have anything. It'll just be this empty data here. So if you want to see, I can make another one for you, but it's just this. It doesn't have anything on it. And basically, we can put this in as the texture target on our scene capture component. So if you click on your scene capture component, you can then drag in your render target. I called mine minimap RT for minimap render target. Now you just drag it into the texture target. It takes over this, and then the render target will then display whatever this camera can see. So as I move this closer to, actually that won't work because it's orthographic, but if I were to, let's say, reposition this, like move it all the way over here, you can see this render target is going to adjust. See, it shows you what the scene capture component 2D can see. So at this point, now you have your map, and you may have a much larger map than this. If you do, not a problem. We're just going to change the orthographic and the ortho width. You can also change these values to do it in increments, like have tiles of a map and different things like that, and you can put it all together into one section. You can get more advanced with it, but for now this is okay. And so change this value. The value by default is, see, 512, so that's what it would see, but that's not quite enough. Even in perspective, like, that's not enough. Doesn't matter if you change the height. Orthographic, just so you guys are aware, so you know why we're changing this, is orthographic means that it's not going to show you the actual like height differences. You can see shadows and things on this one still, but you can see it goes from the actual showing the height and showing this 3D view to basically showing everything in a 2D version. Then you can change the ortho width as needed. I tried 3500 at first. That was the first value I picked, but since it's a little bit off center, the bottom is not shown in that image. If you do 4000, it's still not shown. 4500 you could get away with. 5000, whatever. So I picked 5000 at this point, and you can see that it shows the entire map within that render target. Now you can actually export what this is seeing out to an image. So if you go Asset Actions, Export, you will export this object out to an image. I already have one that I called Minimap Render Target. So basically the name of the render target, and then .hdr is the default type that it is going to be. You can technically save it as some other types, but I haven't actually used them. I definitely use HDR, so I stuck with that type. You save it wherever you want on your computer, and then you're going to have to open this file. It's just going to be an image that is this render target result here. So it's going to be this essentially. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we can actually, let's actually do this so you can see the entire process. So Asset Actions, Export, and we'll save it over the one that we have. Now we need to open it up. You can't use Paint or anything like that to my knowledge. That's the first thing I go to do. But we can, if we go to where it's at, we can open it up with a program called Gimp. It is a free program. It's basically free Photoshop is the way I like to think of it. They're completely different programs, so don't get the wrong idea. But what I'm saying is it has a lot of the features that you would want from something like Photoshop, but it's free, and you're allowed to use it as much as you'd like. I will put the link to Gimp in the description if you'd like to use that. If you do have Photoshop or some other art tool that can open this, feel free to use that. It doesn't really matter what you do, though. Just make sure if you do download Gimp to use it, you then open with, choose an app, and you're going to choose Gimp right here, the application. The link I'm sending you is for Gimp 2.10. That is the current version at the time of making this. And so once you open it with that, then you'll get this to pop up. It's going to do the Gimp startup, and then it's going to load the asset. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can shrink this down for you without messing with Bandicam, but actually I don't think I will be able to, so give me 1 second. Let's shrink this down together. Okay, so I need to bring this back up. Bring this back up. And I need to see. There we go. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so you can see the whole window now. So now I have this HDR, which is essentially just an image. Alternatively, if you don't want to go through all this effort, feel free to just take a photo of it. Now, the reason that that one is a little bit trickier is because the file itself could be pretty small in terms of the actual dimensions, but you're capturing a large area. You could also change the size of the render target to be much larger. That way, when you export it, it is much larger. So you do have a lot of options here. But regardless, if you're using Gimp, here is a quick example of how you can get this to be stylized. So, what I mean by stylized, like I said, you can have like a map that looks like it was hand-drawn and, doesn't look like what you see in the scene, but rather like an actual map. So you can think of, if you're a fan of shooters, you can think of Apex Legends here. You can think of Borderlands here. If you're a fan of open world games like this, you can think of The Witcher here. You can see that the maps do not line up with, everything that you're seeing in the game. They are a stylized rendition of where you're walking. And sometimes you'll notice that not everything is actually displayed on the map. That could be intentional, or it could be because they added things to the map and didn't take another image or make another stylized version. Now, when we're here, again, this is just an example of what you could do. You could actually draw on this as much as you'd like and turn this into a real thing. As you update your level, you are going to have to do this again if you use this method. But it's super easy because we're going to use a material and a texture to display it to our widget, to our HUD. So you'll just have to update the image and that will automatically work. The only thing you have to do is actually update this guy whenever you change something on the map. So you might want to do this toward the end of your map's creation, but you could do this as an example and just not really put a lot of effort into the stylization yet. Now what I like to do is get rid of any points here. I could have made them invisible before taking the render target, but it's super easy to get rid of them. You see I can pick the color picker tool to pick a color, and then I can use the paintbrush tool with a hardness of 100. I like to put, and then I can just paint out anything that was shown here that I don't necessarily want to see on the map. We can add icons and things for these later, so don't worry. It can still be displayed on the map, but we don't want them displayed just because it could see them. We probably want to represent them with an image of some sort. Now this color that you're seeing at the bottom, it's not the wall. This is actually the shadow. So you have the shadow is here and here. You can't see the shadow on these two walls, okay? You can also use the paint bucket tool, but you have to be careful because as you can see here, depending on basically your fill, you could run into trouble. So I like to hit fill similar colors, paint, and then just paint it. Now that will get rid of some of the wall because of the way the shadow was, so you have to be careful if you're using this basic gray layout here. But again, this is just an example, so do with this as you please. Whoops. And that's probably about good. Let's get rid of these guys, that guy. I'm going to use the eyedropper tool to get rid of some of this stuff as well. And this stuff as well. I'll keep those shadows there because why not? That's perfectly fine for now. And what you could actually do if you wanted is you could fill in basically you could outline this, you could outline specific objects or add specific things that you want in here. So this is actually how I had my other one. I didn't modify anything and it looks pretty good. But I can also go in here if I'd like, and let's say we choose black, and let's say we want to just add like a black outline here. Now this is incredibly rough and probably not exactly how you want to do yours, but again, I'm not an artist. So now that is what my mini map will look like. It's in the same position as it was, but you can see that there's this additional like outline here, and you could draw on this. You could take your time or commission someone even if you wanted to and have them make the map for you based on that image, so basically they could draw out their own rendition. Last thing I like to do here is now I'm going to fill this background. You see there's like this dark blue. That's just because that the stage, remember we made it 5,000 so we could get the whole stage. Well, anywhere outside of that is that dark blue, so this like negative space. So what I like to do for that is basically relate that back to a certain color. Like if I want to fill it to black, I could. You could have, you know, like an external thing, so out of bounds. You could have a pattern or something like that. But there you go. Now we can save this image. So I like to save the actual file itself, the Gimp file. That's this XCF. You don't have to do that, but I do like to do that just in case I want to edit this again in the future. It will make, if you make edits to your map in the future, simpler, because you could just add them in the location. You could even use layers and put the two images over top of each other and then add in the stylized additions. So you have a lot of freedom with this. You're gonna have to get creative depending on your map. And then what you want to do is save basically an image or something you can export or import rather back into Unreal. So I'm going to export the entire thing. And I called it this, minimap rt.png, but really I didn't want it to be called the same thing as the render target, so I ended up renaming it to minimap render target image.png. I just typed it in like this. You can manually pick a type and things, but if you just put the extension at the end, it will know it's supposed to be a PNG. And then we can save it wherever. You could save it directly to your Unreal folder. I actually left it separate. That way I could save it first. And then hit export. And now that I have this, if I go into that section right here, I have this image. Okay, so that's my minimap image. Let's close this. We want to copy this if you did not put it in your Unreal project, and we want to bring it on over to where we plan on using that. So where I made a separate minimap folder. That's where I put the minimap render target. That's not required. But at this point, we're going to add a few other things to this folder, a few other things for the minimap. So you might want to create a new folder and call it minimap here. You could put it in assets as well. It doesn't have to be in blueprints because we're not really using a blueprint here. But and I paste it in here and I replace the file. Or if it's the first time you're doing it, you're just going to basically put the file there. Okay. Then what's going to happen is you're going to see that you should have this image in Unreal now. That's what it looks like. Now for me, if I were to save everything, okay, if I were to save everything and play this, you'll see that I have this new minimap. It's stylized. It has the black background, but it also has this outline for this section and this cube right here. Okay. So you can see how you could draw on this and make this very customized. But you won't have that yet, obviously, because we haven't done any of the actual logic for the minimap. That was just getting the image. Now, at this point, once you do this, it's not required that you change anything here or change anything in the render target. They are going to be the same as they have been. We're going to be using this new image that we have from now on to work as the minimap. So you could technically hide or get rid of the scene capture component and the render target because we're just going to be using the image. I'm keeping them because I'm going to update this minimap as we make changes to the map in the future. So I'm going to keep it, but you could disable it as well if you want to for now. That is up to you. Now what you have to do is take your image. When you upload and import a PNG to Unreal, you're going to get a texture. We need to make a material out of this, so I just right click and create material. And then when you get that, I call it m_minimap. M_ is often a naming convention for materials, so you don't have to follow that, but that's why I'm doing that. It's material minimap. And then you can actually right click and create a material instance off that, because that's what we're going to be using on our HUD. If you followed some of my other tutorials, you'll be familiar with that process of making materials into instances and using them on the HUD and using them for user interface stuff. But we're going to make the actual logic of the material in the minimap, okay? And we're going to then use the minimap instance, which is this like image that gets created from the minimap. What the instance really is. It's so we can access it without having to grab all the data that the regular material is using there. And we're going to put this on the HUD. Okay, so we can go into our material minimap that we created from the texture. And you won't have this. You'll only have this texture sample and this final result node. But I'm going to show you how and what the material means and what it does. So basically we have this initial section here. Like I said, this is the texture sample, and we have this result node, which is what gets actually output, and it can be used on our user interface. So when you start out here, you're going to have this right here is going to be surface. It's going to be plugged into something like base color, but we don't actually want that. If you click on this node, you can change the material domain to user interface, which is what we want because we're going to be applying this to our character HUD, which is a widget, which is on the user interface and will not work as surface. I mean, technically it will work as a surface, but there's no reason to have that because that's for a 3D object that we're going to be applying this to, which that is not the case here. So once you change it to user interface, you don't have to change anything else in here, but you will have to redrag in the RGB from the texture sample into the final color because it will disconnect when you make that change. So make sure you drag that into final color, and you won't see anything yet. You'll have the standard image that you have in there, and you'll have the RGB goes into the final color, but that doesn't really help us in terms of relating it back to the minimap in any way. Okay, and so now what we need to do is we need to get the location and the distance of the camera from where we want to be at, all right? And so what I mean by that is, see how the camera is moving with the player? Well, it's not really moving with the player. What it's doing is it's grabbing the player's location, setting that to be the center of where we want to be panning on the minimap. So we're basically scrolling through this image, if you will. It's not using a camera. It's actually literally moving to show different parts of this material instance based on where the player location is. Okay? The way that actually works, if you're curious, before we get into any of this, is because UVs are a position from 0 to 1. They're basically a ratio. So 0, 0 is top left, 1, 0 is top right, 0, 1 is bottom left, and 1, 1 is bottom right. So in this case, UVs are basically a distance or a percentage or a ratio of how far we are at, you know, a certain point. So if we're 0.5, 0.5, we're in the center of this image. And so we have to pass data to the UV to say where we're going to be at. Okay? And so the only way you can grab that data to begin with is to grab the texture coordinates. This is going to be the method you will always use because, again, UVs are from 0 to 1. And so this texture coordinate is the perfect input. It's grabbing the input of the texture itself to relay that information based on information we put in the game, such as where the player is at and other things like that. Okay, so the way you get this is you can type text coord like this, or you can actually type in texture coordinate, which is what that stands for. And it'll come up. It's an input, like I said. It just means it's taking the texture coordinates from this material that we're in, from the texture that the material is based off of. So we're grabbing that, okay, and that's the first node we have here. Now we're going to need parameters and values. Before, when you've seen me add scalars or vector parameters to materials, I've done it right in here, like add scalar, scalar parameter, and I've set this up and I've named it and whatever. The problem with doing that here is we need to actually set these values based on inputs in the game. We're going to need to make something called a collection. That way we can set these variables later. So I'm going to go to where my minimap folder is. So I have my render target, the image, which is a texture, the material that was made from it, and the material instance. And then we have this collection. That's the only thing I didn't go over. So a collection is if you go to add import, materials and textures, material parameter collection. You can read this comment if you'd like, but essentially this is the parameter list for materials. So you just add a new one. It's going to look like this. I called it material parameter collection minimap. When I go in here, there's 4 parameters that I need. And so we need to have the size that we used as the size for the ortho width on the scene capture component 2D. That was 5,000 for me for this case. But you can make it whatever just as long as these match. You could call this ortho width if you'd like, but I prefer size in this case just because it makes more sense to me. We need the X and Y position of the player. And we need the zoom level, which is pretty much always going to be 0.5 by default. Because 0.5 is going to be the center of the area. If I were to change this, without even going into the material itself, if I were to change this value and say I made it 1.0, then you could see that it is 1.0 that's related to the entire material, the entire texture, the size of that. So you can see it does link up to where the character is at to an extent, but all this empty space is being utilized because we're not zooming into the proper location here. Okay, so you have to make this zoom 0.5 by default, or at least that's what we should make it for now, so we can center our icons in the future. You can always change the zoom level or the size of the minimap, but we just have to be prepared for the other changes that requires. So 0.5 basically makes it so, again, you'll have the icon will be at the center. So if you hit a corner or if you go over a landmark like this, you can tell that the center of that minimap is related back to the player location. Okay, so I made size 5000, X position 0, Y position 0, because that's for the character, and the zoom is 0.5. Now, if we go back to our material, we're going to go over this entire thing. So for the material, we need to grab each of our parameters from our material collection parameter. And so what that is our zoom, our X position, our Y position, and our size. Okay. So zoom is, again, where we are at, basically in relation to where the camera is at. So what we do is we grab all 4 of our variables here that we just made in our material parameter collection. And the way we do that is by typing in collection parameter. And you'll have this by default. I like to hit the up arrow so it's smaller, but you can keep it full size if you want. It's just I don't care about the visualization here. Now, when you click on this node, your details panel will change and you can select the parameter you want. What I recommend is selecting one, copying this, pasting it 4 times, and going and selecting the other parameters, because we're going to need each of them. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're going to take our zoom and the texture coordinate input, and we're going to multiply them together. This is going to get us the location that we are going to be viewing the actual minimap at. What we need to do, though, is relate that to where the player is at. So we also need to pan the image around, the texture around, until we get to the right spot. So the zoom is going to say, okay, 0.5 multiplied by the texture coordinate location here. And that's all well and good. But if you just did this, for example, if we literally brought that into the UV, it's going to show you just the default location here in the top left. Okay, you can always drag your result into the UV and the texture sample to see what it's going to do. So as we do this, it's not related to player positioning at all. So it's putting us in the top left corner, basically where we want to be, 0, 0 on that texture by default, but it doesn't actually move. Okay, so that's the first part. If you didn't multiply these at all and you just put the texture coordinate in, you would get the overall texture, okay? Because we're not going to a specific point on the texture. So you can see the entire texture. All right, so that's the difference. That's where the zoom comes in, because the zoom is showing us the level where we want to see the minimap at. So we multiply them together. Literally, you can type multiply, choose that one, and just plug them in together. It's that simple. Okay, so when you do that, that's when you get this actual spot on the minimap chosen saying this is where we want to look at. Now, what we have to do is we have to determine based off the offset, so the offset of the texture and where the player is, where we want to display. So now what we have to do is relate all this back to the position of the character to show where on the texture coordinate we are. So if we divide this by 2, cutting it in half, basically multiply by 0.5 because multiplication is faster than division, but it's the same thing as dividing by 2 here. Then what we're going to do is we're going to end up getting the value of where we're at and the offset that we currently are at. Then what you have to do is subtract this multiplied value from the zoom value, and that gets you the difference between the offset and the actual zoom location, showing us where we want to be on the texture. However, it doesn't actually help us when we don't have X and Y coordinates to figure out where the offset comes from the character. Okay, so if this doesn't make sense for now, that's okay. Basically just know that this is going to get us the location that we care about on this texture coordinate once we have a proper X and Y value. Okay? Now, what we have to do at that point is we have to take our X position and our Y position and divide them by the 5,000, the ortho width, okay, our size variable here. Because what we're doing is we need to get the relevance of this position based on this size. So anyway, long story short, these positions divided by the size will figure out where in relation to the actual spot on the map is this X and Y position relating to. And again, it's going to be the character's X and Y position that we're sending in here. We're going to be dividing them by our size parameter. So drag off of each of your parameters, your X and your Y, and hit divide. Then just pass in size for B on each. Okay. And with this, you still won't have anything that's actually functioning yet. You'll still have this in the top left here. What we need to do is we need to now have our subtracted value result here. So our offset and the locations based on our X and Y position. Okay. And that's where we need to display. That's where we need to move this texture so that it displays the proper data. Now, to do that, all we do is we add the value of the subtract up here that we did for the offset to each the X and the Y result from the division. All right. The order doesn't matter. You can add in any order. So add A. So you add the subtract into B or into A, doesn't matter, but just make sure that both divisions are the result here. Okay, you can see that the X position one does the division and then it does this multiply, and I've set the constant for the other value to be -1. Now this is because this X position is actually related to what direction we're going to be moving up and down. So if I were to hook this back up like normal, okay, and say you don't have this multiply in here. When I move up, it is going to move down on the minimap. The directions are reversed. X and Y are reversed in the case of the texture here, in case of UVs. All right, so make sure you have this multiply on the X. That way, when you add these together and you actually get the local space of the texture space, not world space, then we know where it is in relation to this texture that we should be displaying. Now, append basically just makes them into one object. In this case, we want to do that because we want to actually have them here as a vector for the X and the Y. Make sure in the append node, which you just type append to get, we actually want append vector here. You want to pass in the Y position first, and then the X position second. So the Y divide add should go to A. The X divide multiply by -1 add should go to B. This is going to make the appropriate vector. Okay. And then we're going to add that to the multiplication result we did at the start. Okay. So we're going to add the multiply to the append here. And that's going to multiply the zoom. All right. And it's going to have that result added to each of these values. And so now, if you were to do this, you'd see that it works. And we can run around and it's perfect. Now, something you should always do is clamp these values. You want to clamp these values on when you're passing things to UVs because UVs only have a value of 0 to 1. Otherwise, they restart. So if you go past 1, it's going to basically have a tile effect, or it's just going to be completely invisible depending on how you set it up. But this taking this final result and clamping it between the default values of 0 and 1, you don't have to change them. It just assumes it's 0 and 1. Clamping them to that value will make sure that you're always within the texture space, the proper texture space. You then pass this into the UVs on the texture sample, and you get your actual material. Like I said, this is a well-known method, and this is how we have it being done in our personal project that we're working on. So I think this is a great way to make a stylized map material. Now, once you have this, we need to actually display this to the user and set the data up correctly. That way this data moves and adjusts this, the location and the zoom displayed on this texture. Now, to do that, let's go ahead and set this up. So we need a widget to display this stuff. Now, we actually have a character HUD here that works. So I have two mini maps. We have our basic mini map that we made in the other episode, which shows it's just a camera that is displaying the data here. Okay. But we also have, what I've done is I have hidden it, set the visibility to hidden so it's not on the HUD at runtime. And then I've also toggled the eye so that I can't see it on the HUD. But I've left it there in case we ever want to re-enable that one. Then I have this. So I made another widget because we need to actually have a widget that can set the data for the minimap here. And I passed that into the character HUD. So let's do that now. So make a new widget, user interface widget blueprint. I called it minimap. Okay, so in our minimap widget that we just made, all I have in here is an image that I have anchored to full size. And this is going to basically be, we're going to put this on our character HUD, and this is going to display the minimap based on the information that we give it. So you can literally go to common and drag an image in, or type in image in the palette, in the search palette here. I called it minimap image. I did make it a variable. It was actually a variable by default for me in this case because I brought it right under the canvas panel, but feel free to check that if you want. We don't need to adjust it for this time, so it's not necessary. And then for the image, we want to put in our material instance that we made. So not the material itself, but the material instance. So we want minimap instance. And then I've anchored it to the bottom right one, which is the entire thing. I've changed all the values to 0. That way it fills the entire screen. Not really the entire screen, the entire widget space of this canvas panel, which is what we're going to be adding to our character HUD. Once you have this here, we have to actually set the values, like I was showing you earlier, the scalar parameter values for the collection parameters. That way we can have the X position and the Y position based on the character location. All right. So what we need to do is we have event tick here. If you don't have it, you deleted it. It will be here by default when you make a new widget, but you can always just type it in and get a new event tick. What we need to do is grab the owning player pawn, get the location, and use the result of get actor location to set these variables so that the material knows where the character is in relation to things like edges of the map and what to display on that texture. Okay, so we want to get the owning player pawn, not just get owning player, but the pawn. That's our character. We want to drag off of that and get the actor location. Actually, let me show you this one. Get actor location. And we want to split this. By splitting this, we get the X, Y, and Z. So then we have to pass in the X and the Y to the correct parameters. So remember I was showing you this earlier. Set scalar parameter value. You need to pass in a collection. So here's where we choose our material parameter collection for the minimap. Click the down arrow to select the variables we were setting. We're setting the X position. I'm going to copy this. We're going to set the Y position. We pass in the X, and we pass in the Y. So you can set this up in your event tick just like this. And now what will happen is this widget will have the information of the owner's X and Y location. And it will know, based off the material, that when we do this and convert it to texture space, oh, they're at this point related to the size. So related to where this image is and how it relates back to world space, the character standing in this location or wherever. Okay? So we need to make sure that this goes on our character HUD, and we need to make sure that the owner of the HUD can be basically referenced here to get their location. So if you go to your character HUD, you can go ahead and search for your new widget now, which I just called minimap. It'll have like a heart with some lines next to it. That's how you know it's your widget. You can drag it in wherever you like. I brought this one in here. I haven't anchored it or anything like that. I just manually and arbitrarily brought it over, but feel free to change that as you need. Again, it's a variable by default, but we don't actually use this. You don't have to do anything in the graph. You literally just have to set this up here, make this mini map, and you're good to go. We have to set the owner though, okay? So to do that, we have to go into where the widget was spawned, which for me is in the base game mode BP. And so I had all this logic in here. This is setting up quests, the first quest, and adding them to the box, just as an example of how to use our quest system. What we need to do is we spawn our HUD at the very start of begin play, and I set a reference. I also set the owning player before adding it to the viewport. That way, when we try and get the owning player pawn, we know what controller it is. So since this is a single player game at the in the example here, we can use get player controller 0 here and know that this is correct. In the future, we will want to update this to make sure it's the right player controller. But literally, off of the HUD reference that we set, or the create character HUD widget if you like, you go ahead and you drag off of it and type set owning player. You need a local player controller. So I get player controller, leave it at index 0, pass in to local player controller, and I've set the owner. By setting the owner, this minimap will now be able to get a valid value here, which means it will return an actual location, which means it can get the actual X and Y location. Now, with all that done, we can finally play our game, and you should see that the minimap widget is relating back to the actual thing that we made here. So you can see that the texture space is working. It is displaying the proper location based off where the player is, and we are good to go. In the next episode, we're going to go over adding icons to each object. So as, for example, we have our player, we can render an icon for that. We can render things like a map pickup, like the sword, or, you know, like item. And we can also render like enemy locations on it as well. We're going to cover all that in the next episode. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for the series and for myself than anything else you can do, and it is completely free. I would like to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. Thank you guys for continuing to support me and just give me all this appreciation. I am so incredibly grateful, and I love this community, so thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it and always get excited to see you guys showing support. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to get you sorted for free. And anyway, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.